The ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas has been met with celebrations around the world, including here in Australia. Our next guest has recently spent time in Israel with families of hostages, and Michael Chaitow is Executive Director of the New Israel Fund and joins us in the studio. Michael, great to have you with us. How would the families be feeling today?
Look, I won't pretend to be in the minds of the hostages. What I can say is that I've spoken with my friends, my colleagues, people on the ground, and people are hopeful, they're optimistic, but they remain cautious. We've seen these deals get very close before and unfortunately be derailed. We know that 33 people are to come home, but we don't know how many of them will be alive. We do know that the bombing will continue. It has been continuing, and indeed, I think many of my friends, colleagues, partners on the ground are wondering how many lives will be lost unnecessarily up until that point.
Michael, you were in Israel and observed yourself the mass protests that had been happening, demanding Netanyahu do more to free the hostages. Given that it's taken 15 months and 46,000 Palestinian lives and over 1,000 Israeli lives just to get to this point, how do Israelis feel about their government?
Yes, well, I've been there several times during the course of this government, and every time I've attended protests, the people have been taking to the streets for 104 plus weeks, more than 2 years, led by organisations that we support, like Standing Together. Those protests are taking place because the Israeli government is extremely unpopular. This is a far-right messianic government led by a prime minister who is standing trial for corruption. People know that he is only serving his own self-interest, and people are seeing through that. They're not hopeful that this deal will necessarily go through or go beyond the 6 weeks that it's scheduled to take place for, and that's precisely because they've seen how Netanyahu acts in his own self-interest.
Well, let's talk about those self-interests. He opposes the existence of a Palestinian state, and we've seen more land being claimed for Israel through settler violence. So what is the feeling there of the view that Netanyahu is motivated by more than defending Israel and releasing the hostages?
Yes, well, certainly Netanyahu couches it in the terms of defending what were horrific and awful attacks on October 7th that are absolutely unjustifiable. And yet we know that the work of the settlers in the extremist annexation efforts that they're undertaking are enabled by the government. The government has settlers in its cabinet, and it is supporting this work. That's why we at the New Israel Fund are investing in organisations like Rabbis for Human Rights or Yesh Din, who are doing work to combat this. We know that they need to do this work because they are the only force that is standing in the way of what is the government's self-proclaimed desire to annex territory in the occupied Palestinian territories.
Is the word genocide used by Israelis to describe what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank?
I'll leave the words that Israelis are using for them to say themselves. What I will say is that we at the New Israel Fund are focused on what our partners are saying. I woke up today to the Bereaved Families Forum, who issued a statement welcoming this news, but they also said that violence has only begot violence. It will continue to contribute to unnecessary suffering. A political solution is not a desirable thing. It is not a thing that we should strive towards. It's an actual necessity. It's the only thing that will guarantee safety and security for all.
The ceasefire begins on Sunday, but even as it was announced, Palestinians in Gaza were targeted and killed. The ceasefire is only for 6 weeks. Does Australia have any influence as to what happens after that?
Certainly the Australian government has a role to play. It has been calling for a ceasefire, it has been calling for the return of the hostages, and we welcome this. Indeed, the Attorney General is headed over there this week for talks with Israelis and with Palestinians. The Australian government has played its role, but it must go further. It must place pressure upon all parties to act in good faith. We have seen these negotiations get so close and then completely go away. Like we saw in November, they were not renewed beyond November of 2023, and there is a role to play for the Australians to say, we are allies with these parties because we share values. We share liberal democratic values, and liberal democratic values ensure the protection of civilians, the returning of hostages, the observation of international law under all circumstances. And so we call on the government to relay this directly to the Israeli government and to the people it's speaking to in the Palestinian Authority.
What needs to happen within this 6-week ceasefire window?
What needs to happen is we in civil society, we at the New Israel Fund and those organisations we support on the ground need to maintain the pressure, because the pressure is what got us to this point. far, far too late. Far too many lives have been lost unnecessarily, but we know that it is the pressure that has ultimately been brought to bear on this government and on Palestinian negotiators that has led to this point. We must raise up our voices. We have a role to play here at home in calling for our government to do more, and indeed civil society on the ground, those organisations that we sponsor must take to the streets, must continue to do so as they've done for more than 2 years, and really must raise their voice against this government and for a ceasefire and hostage deal.
All right, Michael Chaitow, thanks for coming into the studio. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.